The war in Iraq, we discussed some detail looking at the road to the war in Iraq, and now we also look at what the actual impact was. Now, again, to recap, the road to war with Iraq in 2003 started immediately after 9/11. Bush declared a doctrine of preventive war. Again, that's important to see the distinction. A preemptive war is that you have clear and present information on clear and present dangers imminent, something will happen, you will be attacked. You have to preempt that by attacking. A preventive war, we're looking at something in a more distant future that a country might at some point in the future may pose a threat to you. And that was seen as Iraq, that the alleged non-existent WMDs were to pose a threat to the US. George Bush said in April 2002, the war on terror will not be won on the defensive. We must take the battle to the enemy. Iraq was seen as an agent of terrorists and an ally of terrorists, supplying them with WMDs. Facing clear evidence of peril, Bush said we cannot wait for the final proof of the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud. Again, that particular term, the mushroom cloud, the smoking gun, that was used by Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor, and that sort of narrative was then picked up by members of the Iraq group in the White House, which then went on to sell the war with Iraq to the public. Keep in mind, at that point, people were still traumatized of 9/11 and feared any attack from Iraq, and Iraq itself was feared by members of the US public. Congress authorized Bush to use force in Iraq. Colin Powell was the last person, as I mentioned earlier, to ask for caution. He wanted another UN Security Council resolution which would authorize the use of force. He managed to get a resolution 1441, which found Iraq in material breach of previous resolutions looking at disarmament and WMD non-proliferation, gave Iraq a final opportunity to cooperate with inspectors and warned that it will face a serious consequence. And Russia and other states, but particularly those two, because they're permanent members of the UN Security Council, voted in favor in understanding that it did not authorize military action, and they also made it clear, France in particular, that they would not authorize any future UN Security Council resolution which was explicitly authorized the use of force. The UN, as well as the UK, interpreted that would give them a legal backing to use force in Iraq, which largely was understood that it wasn't. Now, what were the consequences? UN weapons inspectors were appointed by the White House, and they concluded in 2004 that Iraq had in fact abandoned its WMD program years ago. Western intelligence agencies had been fooled by a mixture of deception, corruption, and mismanagement by the Iraqi military. The Iraq Survey Group, which was again appointed by the White House, also concluded in 2004 there were no WMDs, and the subsequent charges were directed at Bush for grossly misrepresenting intelligence. So again, we discussed about the politicization of intelligence, exaggeration, and the clear lies in that chapter of U.S. foreign policy. So the invasion happened without valid understanding of the Iraqi government, the sectarian differences, no plans, no money, no staff to provide political control, security. In my previous model, we looked at State Department and DoD failed to communicate who was in charge, who was in charge politically, the armed forces, or in fact diplomatic staff at the US State Department. Effective Iraqi security forces really wasn't a priority until 2004. There was no training, no resources. And then, of course, US armed forces have been pushed into a myriad of tasks, nation building, counterinsurgency, as well as stability operations. Now, again, there was an overestimation about how quickly the war would pay for itself, that Iraq would start producing. After all, it has the second largest oil reserves in the world, and that would bankroll the war. That has not happened. Now, again, to recap the question of why did the US invade Iraq? Well, one, that you could look at bureaucratic failures, genuine fears of WMDs within certain members of the administration, bureaucratic politics, looking at DoD in particular eclipsing State Department and the CIA, and groupthink that the decision had been made to invade Iraq. Nobody really wanted, except for Colin Powell to the very last, and then he was swayed too, wanted to challenge the president on that. Richard Haas, the Council of Foreign Relations president, said that it was the first war of necessity. It was not a war of choice. Whether the US wanted to control all the oil is one thing, but they certainly did not want Saddam Hussein to have control over the second largest oil reserve in the world. Neoconservative vision, so again, neocons had key positions in the Bush administration, had always had this vision of a Saddam Hussein-free Middle East. A lot of them started to, champion that idea. There were, the Pentagon became the lead agency, both as far as international terrorism was concerned, intelligence, but also foreign policy formulation and implementation. So again, both CIA and State Department were eclipsed by the DoD. There's this document, Clean Break, which was written by US academics in 1996 for Benjamin Netanyahu, the then Prime Minister of Israel. And that vision was to break with the Oslo process, secure Israel's regional dominance, as well as remove Saddam Hussein. Again, many of those authors were then in the administration, George W. Bush administration, and largely, 9/11 presented them with an opportunity to really fulfill this vision of a Saddam Hussein-free Iraq. And then we mustn't forget the British connection, that Tony Blair really had made up its mind that the world would be better without Saddam Hussein. And also he was given a rather dubious legal counsel by his Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, that it could be justified on the grounds of not regime change, but on the fact that WMDs had to be destroyed, and it was forcible removal of WMDs by a UK force. Now, what happened afterwards? Iraq, the Iraqi government was incredibly weak central government. It was corrupt, divided into nepotistic sectarian cliques. It was still highly dependent on oil rents, very vulnerable to external shocks. So if you have a financial crisis like you had in 2008, any of these hydrocarbon-reliant economies, that affects the GDP tremendously. 20, 30, 40%, it takes a huge hit because you only have one resource which you're selling. A legislative process was going at a snail pace, so again, a lot of legislation needed for human rights protection wasn't happening. And most importantly, the government lacked a monopoly of violence. Security forces primarily owed loyalty to their constituent sectarian factional blocs. For most of that, the height of the insurgency, 2003, 2007, a lot of those militias created no-go zones. And then you also had an absence of a multi-ethnic police force. You had Shia-only security forces and Kurdish-only security forces in the north. And then the central government was challenged by regional and local power brokers. So within powerful, militia leaders, religious figures, as well as the Saudis, the Turks, the Iranians, other Gulf states, all were meddling in Iraqi affairs. Now, again, the nature of the civil war, it was driven by a complex mesh of sectarian factional drivers, communal tensions at neighborhood level. So you had these vendettas and revenge killings, much like gang violence. But multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian communities were homogenizing. So what you had previous Christian, Shia, Sunni, Kurdish environments. It became Kurdish only, Shia only, Sunni only, Christian only. So again, this was happening. This was happening with violence, the threats of violence, forcible expulsion of families from houses and neighborhoods. And most importantly, ever since Iraq was created by the British at the beginning of the 20th century, Iraq was a Shia-dominated, Shia-majority country, but it had always been governed by a Sunni minority. Now again, after the invasion, for the first time in history, you actually had a Shia Arab government. That never happened before. So, of course, you had the Sunni Arab minority had a very hard time to accommodate themselves to, also now being a political minority. That, of course, resulted in the Shia Iraqi government, approving and engaging in revenge killings. And you had many of those politicians who had been in power, had either been in exile in Iran, trained in exile in Iran, in Europe, or the rest of the Middle East, or in the United States. So again, you had a series of assassinations, bombings, kidnappings. You had all of that, and Iraq really became this regional hub for organized crime and terrorism after 2003. Now again, to understand where we are today, looking at the rise of ISIS, looking at the civil war in Iran, it comes down to the disenfranchisement of an entire group. So you had the gradual disenfranchisement of Sunni, you had the rise of Sunni jihadi groups, different Sunni militias, you had more Iraqi dominated groups, you had a lot of international Sunni jihadis from Saudi Arabia, across the Gulf, from North Africa, Afghanistan. All of which really wanted to, one, of course, bleed the Americans and the Iraqi government as much as possible. So there was a lot of bloodletting, and really, carve out some sort of autonomy for themselves within that Iraq. Now, again, looking at the United States and the Iraqi government actually had a successful counterinsurgency, and that was, the so-called Sunni Awakening 2009, 2008, 2009. A lot more coupled with the surge, so a lot of more U.S. Troops were brought into to secure urban areas which had been subject to lots of killings and bombings, kidnappings, and largely the Iraqi population, of course, had turned against Al Qaeda, had turned against a lot of these jihadi groups of what indiscriminate violence they were engaging. Now, the so-called Sunni Awakening or the Sons of Iraq campaign was successful because what was offered by the U.S. government and by the default by the Iraqi government, but backed by U.S. forces, was that Iraqi Sunni tribal leaders were being put in charge of security. So they had their own militias for the first time. These militias were recognized as part of essential element of the security equation, make them part. And that, of course, is not unusual in politics. If somebody is outside and challenging you, you bring them into the fray, you make them part of the mainstream, you pay them, you bring them close to you. And this is exactly what happened. And this is how Al Qaeda was destroyed. Looking at the end of 2009, there was the surge, and it was the Sunni Awakening or the Sons of Iraq initiative. Now, what happened then, however, rather than rewarding them for having destroyed Al Qaeda, the Shia government in Iraq continued with a crackdown against Shia politicians, even high-profile Shia politicians, all the way up to vice presidents. Other Sunni politicians, and a lot of them ended up in dungeons, were tortured, were killed, disappeared, and that led to a period of instability, mass protests, demonstrations, more violence against the Iraqi government for failing to honor that pledge that they were brought in. The fray, were enfranchised, were part of the government. Now, again, at the same time, what happened was, looking at 2011, fast forward 2011, 2012, 13, was the Syrian civil war that you had there. All of a sudden, you had a Shia allied Arab government, the Assad regime, fighting against minority over Sunni majorities. So again, it's the way around, that you have a minority, a Shia Alawite, but de facto Shia allied minority in the government governing over a Sunni majority. So you had a lot of those, as the war became more vicious, and that we're really looking at 2012, the beginning. A lot of those jihadis went back into Iraq, were freeing Sunni prisoners from Iraqi prisons. Then they went back into Syria, fighting the Assad regime. You had a lot of weapons all of a sudden being available because you had a lot of members of the army which were defecting, joining the insurgency in Syria. And what you had is that gradually, these rebels morphed into more radical elements. Some groups called themselves the Islamic State. And went back into Iraq, had these campaigns to free prisoners, until 2014, where again the idea was to go to Mosul, free prisoners, and go back and kill as many Shia as possible. When Mosul fell, Mosul, the second largest city of Iraq, fell and had been conquered by ISIS. This was the turning point. That this was second largest city. The Iraqi army crumbled in the defense, had left. Most of them had left already before ISIS had arrived, and it was after that that ISIS became what it is today. It was a terrorist group which was operating transnationally, but also which was governing for the first time. So again, to understand the rise of ISIS, you go back at the beginning, invasion of Iraq, Governor Bremer, who was in charge of Iraq, he disbanded the Iraqi military, creating a jobless army of several 100,000 military men. The de-Baathification was supposed to be the same as denazification, that sent tens of thousands of Sunni state employees and technocrats into poverty. Again, keep in mind that the majority of Baathist Iraq under Saddam Hussein were working in the public sector. And then the US written Iraqi constitution also enshrined sectarianism. So again, that was another legal problem. And again, I mentioned the failure of the new government to convince now again Sunni Arabs that they should join them again, like they did in 2009 with the Sunni awakening, to fight ISIS. But of course, they said, well, I don't think so. We were betrayed by you back then. And that led to the rise of these radical elements in the first place. So you can see that the rise of ISIS is not a Syrian thing, it's not an Iraqi thing. It really is, started in 2003 after the invasion of Iraq, and then, was exacerbated through the Syrian civil war. So what are the main factors? Unprecedented violence unleashed by the Assad regime, total civil war along ethnic and religious lines. The international community did not act early on or work with regional players to have some sort of political solution. Funding support from the Gulf, looking at the Saudis and others. And then, of course, what I just said, the political marginalization of Sunni Muslims in Iraq by Maliki's government, the Shia government under Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Now, again, if you look at the ISIS, we have modern forms of violence and terror, murder, humiliation, sexual violence. Looking at enemies as non-Muslim bodies, as a manifestation of something which has to be destroyed, and they have this clear hold build tactic. So unlike other terrorist groups which work in the shadows, which attack, it actually governs. It's part. It had created this system in places like Mosul after 2014, where ISIS is engaged in Islamic governance, or at least how they view Islamic governments. Of course, they violate every principle of Muhammad's Islamic State in Medina in the 7th century, and really have created this fascist, regime. Now, again, this picture shows al-Baghdadi, who, again, is his rise to power is typical of that he was member of Iraq's intelligence system, then went into was one of those who actually helped the insurgency back in 04, 05, 06, 07 because he knew how to do it. And then morphed gradually in that radical Islamist movement, and then exacerbated by Syria, by the situation in Iraq, then became the leader of what then they call themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS. That was a big deal. Here he is giving a talk during daylight in Mosul, in what it was previously, part of the, a new Iraq, You had U.S. forces there. You had the Iraqi army, which collapsed when ISIS arrived. And here he is, not like Bin Laden, having videotapes and caves and sending them out, but here he is filming himself as he was giving a talk, a sermon during the day in Iraqi, in the second largest city in Iraq. So again, if you look at the who is who of you have so many different militias and armed forces fighting in Iraq and Syria. So again, the reason why it's so complicated is you have not only all of these militias, but then you have also outside forces, the United States, European powers, and of course the Saudis, the Iranians, the Turks, all of which have their own proxies they are funding. Now, the problem with ISIS is, of course, one is the most immediate threat is to Iraqis and Syrians, those who have to suffer from that rule in those countries. But then also what we've seen since 2014, that these walk-in volunteers who came from Europe or from other Western countries or from Middle East, but then go back to Europe, go back to the United States. So again, what the head of the Belgian police said after the Brussels attack in 2014, that right now what we're seeing that criminals actually becoming radical. So what you had before, the typical radicalization process was that you had, person who had never been in trouble with the law before, feeling strongly about, political realities in the Middle East or in the West, and that sort of message strikes a chord with them, and then they engage in terrorism. What we see with these were actually also already persons who had been convicted of petty crime and other violent crime, who then actually embraced that message ISIS had and engaged in terrorism. So that was an interesting aspect, that they had already been on the radar, not for political crimes, but in fact petty crimes and other violent behavior. Now again, but going back to Iraq, human rights and democracy it's a far cry from what we would consider a liberal democracy. That you have the constitution itself offers very few unqualified rights to Iraqis. It leaves a lot out to future parliaments to actually come up with legislation protecting human rights. And of course, over the last decade, the security situation really has encouraged human rights abuses that counterinsurgency operations by government forces as well as militias, were engaging in human rights violation with reference under the disguise of cracking down against insurgents or terrorists. So if you look at the balance sheet, it certainly did not transform the Middle East. We have still a very unstable balance of power politics situation in the Middle East. The intervention, the idea was to intimidate anti-American actors. Again, US displayed formidable firepower in 2003. That is true, but it did not start a chain reaction. Certainly did not encourage Arab-Israeli peace or reduce the threat of terrorist attacks against the United States. Now, none of these things happened except for intimidation, perhaps, of anti-American actors when we're looking at peer competitors. You're looking at countries wanting to threaten or challenge the United States. That certainly does not apply to non-state actors. After the withdrawal of US forces, Iraq's ruling Shia had moved quickly to keep the two sects separate and unequal, and part of that led to the rise of ISIS in Syria as well as Iraq. The Arab Spring further undermined US power projection in the region. All of those countries which were allied to the United States as part of the war on terror actually had to go through democratic protests. Some successfully, most actually had crushed those protests, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, for example, Bahrain. And then, the Saudis, we see this new form of nationalism and foreign policy adventurism. The Saudis in particular intervene in Bahrain and Yemen and Syria, and continue to meddle in Iraq. So all in all, the war in Iraq really represented a systemic shock to the entire region and really had created over, a decade of what now is almost could be considered a perpetual war.